Professor Rodžera Valdingera from the University of California at Los Angeles, and who is a very well-known expert on migration issues, and it's our pleasure to have you here, and I hope that the lecture will be interesting for students. There will be hope that there will be questions after that, and so that more than 1 hour, then we may have. But of course, it's up to you. It's not that we have to finish in strict time. Okay, the floor is yours.
Great. Okay, so thank you very much for that generous introduction, and thanks to Baiba for arranging my visit. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be able to be here to present my research. Now, I should say that I have a tendency to talk very quickly, so I will do my best to try to slow down. But if you think that I'm going too quickly or I've sped up, please don't hesitate to tell me that I should slow down. Now, the lecture that I'm going to give connects with a very vibrant field in migration studies, and one in which there is both a lot of research and a lot of debate. On the other hand, it is a somewhat specialized talk, and it is a bit schematic, because what I'm going to try to do is to try to develop a framework for understanding the relationship between sending states or immigration states on the one hand and immigrants on the other. So what I'll do is first to try to open up the presentation, to try to present the intellectual context, what it is that's motivating this paper, this presentation, and then I will go into greater detail. Now, and let me just say that you should feel free to ask for clarification. So questions, if I'm not clear or if you want further information, raise your hand at any point in time. Then we can have time at the end for more critical discussion. Okay, so yes. Okay, so this is really a paper that engages with what I've described as the political sociology of international migration. IM stands for international migration. And as I tried to explain in the lecture I gave yesterday, international migration is an inherently political phenomenon. It is, of course, a social phenomenon like other forms of movement. It involves social and psychological displacement, but it entails the crossing of political boundaries. So, it means the movement of people from there to here, from one country to another, and the movement of people who are foreigners and also aliens, and point I'll try to talk about at greater length. And there is a very large literature that focuses on the politics of immigration. That is, so the politics associated with the movement of people to destination states. And by and large, that is a literature that focuses either on the politics and policies surrounding control over the borders, issues related to the number of immigrants that might be desired, the types of immigrants, the types of control policies that are used to manage these flows, and then a second literature that is oriented more towards the politics of post-immigration, that is to say, the rights that immigrants might enjoy and the conditions under which they become citizens. And this is a very large and vibrant field in migration studies, and of course, it is a field with a comparative dimension. And one of the things that's interesting, I think, about migration studies or the study of international migration is that the politics of migration policy and the politics of citizenship recur across all destination societies. Of course, they take a different form, but we see patterns that reproduce themselves across the world. But I'm interested in this lecture, in particular, in the other side of the coin, and that has to do with the policy of politics related both to sending states and to immigrants. Now, I'm sorry, I'm not looking at my own slides, so I'm forgetting some of the points I want to make. So I emphasize that political sociology of international migration focuses on policy, but the other part of it is, of course, the politics of immigrants. So that one of the things that's interesting about immigrant politics is, of course, because they enter as aliens, immigrants move into a society but are not in its polity. And yet, even though they're outside the polity, they're able to engage in political action. So there are these two dimensions, one that looks at state policy, the other one that looks at immigrant politics. What I'm interested in is the other side of the coin. That is to say, the policies that are undertaken by immigration states as they try to extend across borders to connect with their people living in foreign places, and the parallel action of the immigrants who try to extend themselves across borders to influence policies and politics in the state where they no longer live. Now, both of these aspects, that is to say, the political sociology of international migration, the political sociology of immigration, these are inherent aspects of the same phenomenon. Now, what I want to emphasize in this talk is that these interactions between sending states and immigrants are driven by a set of dualities that are inherent in the migration process itself. And the first is a duality that relates to the social nature of migration. That is to say that on the one hand, the people who cross borders are immigrants. Immigrants in the kind of dictionary definition of the word, that is to say, people who move for the purposes of settlement. Now, many of the people who move don't think of themselves as necessarily settlers. Many of them move with the idea of being temporary, of returning home, but regardless of the initial intentions, nonetheless, they can't help themselves but adapt to the needs and requirements of the society in which they now are living. That in order to make it, in order to get ahead, in order to survive, they are forced to change and then ineluctably become, in some important ways, more like the people among whom they're living. But the very same people, so we can think about the immigrants, the people crossing borders as, on the one hand, being oriented towards the place in which they're living, but simultaneously they continue to be oriented towards the place from which they come. They may think they're going to return. They are often sending home resources. They are in contact with the people back home. And they may often be in-person contact, not simply call or telephone, but return trips. So the people who are immigrants are also immigrants, and they are contending with that tension between this orientation towards the place where they're living and the simultaneous orientation towards the place from which they come. Now that focuses on migration as a social process, but one of the distinguishing characteristics of international migration, of course, is that it is movement across territorial boundaries. So the same people who are immigrants are also aliens. That is to say, they are outside the polity, they are not citizens of the place where they live, and therefore they don't share the fundamental rights, or let's put it more clearly, they lack the fundamental rights enjoyed by citizens. But the very same people who are citizens the very same people who are aliens are also citizens of the state from which they come. And what that means is that the emigration state has a set of obligations to the people who no longer live in their territory. So in the place where they live, the immigrants are aliens, but insofar as they are immigrants, they retain citizenship and therefore claims that can be made on the sending state. Now, so alien versus citizen, that emphasizes the political dimension. Immigrant versus emigrant, that emphasizes the orientation of the migrants. But there is another aspect, and that is foreigner versus national. And that then refers to the relational aspect that, the relational issues that immigration engenders. Because on the one hand, for the immigrants, they are moving from the environment that they know to the environment that is unfamiliar, that is strange, that is foreign. They're moving to there. In moving to there, they are encountering, they are surrounded by people who look at them as if they were them. That is, the them who ought to be there, but instead has come here to the society where we live. So they are foreign in that double sense. They're foreigners in a foreign environment, and they're treated as foreigners and as outsiders. But even though they are thought of as foreign in the place where they live, from the standpoint of the people of the place from which they come, they're thought of as part of us, as nationals to whom the people and the state continue to have an obligation. All right? So, but it's not a legal formal obligation as in the case of citizenship. It's more a moral obligation that comes from the view, the understanding that part of the national family is located somewhere else, and they can't be ignored. Now, then there is an identity dimension, and this I'm describing the identity dimension by using the term membership. And so, on the one hand, the immigrants/emigrants are not members in the place where they live, so they're treated as outsiders, they don't belong. In fact, they might, even though they might sometimes become official members in the sense that they acquire citizenship, nonetheless, the fact that they are of foreign origin leads the dominant group to perceive them as not being part of the people, as being non-members. By contrast, with respect to the sending states, the migrants assert their own membership. That is, they're no longer living in the place of destination, but their argument is, again, by dint of origin, because they originated in that place, they continue to be members. Okay. Now, so these are the dualities that I'm going to try to emphasize, and I will try to show how they drive this interaction between sending and receiving states. Now, I do want to make some qualifications. So the first is that I'm not trying in this presentation to develop a general theory of migration or a general theory of ethnic assimilation. So there are all sorts of dimensions of international migration. I'm not treating them all. I'm treating one narrow slice, that is to say, the interaction between sending states and immigrants. The dualities that I have highlighted, in my view, are the key variables. And I'm not going to discuss anything else. I'm not going to discuss issues related to class, issues related to race or ethnicity, issues related to gender. And the underlying argument is that insofar as they affect these interactions, they affect them in predictable ways. So they're not interesting from the standpoint of the argument I'm trying to develop. Now, of course, you can quarrel with me. That might be a good topic for the question and answer, but that's my assumption. Now, this is not a theory of immigration. I'm also not talking about all types of migrations. So in particular, I'm not talking about migrations from within the developing world. So I'm not talking about what we would call south-to-south migration. And for the most part, I am not talking about migration among the most developed, among the richest countries. So what I'm talking about is migration from poorer to richer countries, and countries that also have a specific political type of organization, that is to say, liberal democracies. I'm not that concerned about the political system in the country of emigration, although that's an important variable, but I am interested, I mean, the scope is limited to liberal democracies. Okay, two things I think are missing from the paper, although I believe it's already too long. One is I don't focus on the chronological dimension. I don't talk about change over time. Now, I think that the overall framework is reasonably applicable to the migrations from 1850 to today. But there really won't be any historical discussion in what follows, and I don't deal with variations in the ethnic or political characteristics of the sending states. Okay, now this is really where the background is missing, and I'll try to sketch it in very quickly. So the field of migration studies has really been swept by a new perspective that is associated with the concept of transnationalism. Now, transnationalism or transnational social movements or transnational politics is actually a subject matter that isn't only limited to migration. It's found, for example, in international relations. World historians or global historians talk about transnationalism. The term turns out to have at least two very, very different meanings in the social sciences, and one can identify two literatures that use it and make no reference to one another. So my interest is in the concept of transnationalism as it has developed in migration studies. And this is a literature that has just taken off. So it's a concept that was introduced at the periphery of the discipline by people who were relatively unknown, and it somehow or another caught everyone's imagination. And if you do a literature search, or if you go back to, when you go back home or go to your office and you look at Google Scholar and you type in transnationalism, you'll see a huge number of citations that will come up. Now, there is so what is it, what's the phenomenon to which the concept refers? Well, I think the concept refers to the ongoing connections between sending and receiving states that inherently arise when international migration occurs. Now, what is it? Why is that so exciting? What's so revolutionary about that? I think the answer lies in the fact that historically migration studies have been immigration-oriented. That is to say, they have been oriented towards the cross-border movers in their capacity as immigrants oriented towards settlement, and they have not observed that these same immigrants are also emigrants, that even as they're adapting to the conditions under which they live, they continue to maintain very strong contacts with the place left behind. And so this perspective, in many ways, runs counter to the large scholarship on, quote, assimilation, which essentially has scholars with their backs at the border, so they're not looking at all of the things that feed back to the society of origin, and are simply looking at what happens to the immigrants in the society of destination. Now, you might not think that that's terribly revelatory, what's new there, and those are good thoughts to have, but this, nonetheless, has been a very exciting concept. And I think it does represent a significant advance in that it pushes migration studies away from this orientation simply towards a destination society, and it emphasizes the importance and the persistence of these cross-border linkages, of all the things that flow from receiving states to sending states and back. But the problem with this literature, and again, I can talk about it in much greater detail, and if you're interested in this literature or in my research, you can go to I have two websites where I have all of my papers, all of my publications are available. So type in my name into Google, and that'll get you to the sites, and you can download as many papers as you can stand to read. So The problem, I believe, with this perspective is that it stops exactly where it should begin. In other words, it is important to note that immigrants are also emigrants, that they maintain, they generate these cross-border connections, but that's just the beginning of the discussion. Then we want to know, well, how do the immigrants vary in the types of connections that they maintain? Who is it that engages in immigrant politics? Who is it that is mainly focused on maintaining social connections? We want to know to what extent these connections vary across the lifetime of an immigrant. Is this something that persists for decades, or is this something that is relatively evanescent? And again, what is it that accounts for variations? Because undoubtedly some immigrants retain that dual orientation for a very long time, but for others it gets cut off. So how can we explain these differences in persistence? We also want to explain differences in the degree to which the home country connection is transmitted from immigrant parents to immigrant children. Right? The immigrant parents, after all, bring that interest in the home country or that loyalty with them, but the children who are usually born and brought up in the destination society, they don't have that exposure. So how, if at all, do they obtain some orientation, some attachment to the home society? And why is it that some immigrant children continue to be oriented towards their parents' place of origin, and others are completely disinterested? So I think that this transnational perspective points to an interesting phenomenon, but it doesn't provide us with a framework for understanding variations in the degree, type, and persistence of these transnational ties. Now, what I'm interested in this paper is I'm not interested in questions relating to the maintenance of a transnational identity. I'm not interested in this paper in explaining why is it that some immigrants maintain very intense connections to the homeland and others maintain more peripheral connections. What I'm interested in is trying to explain the interactions between sending states with emigrants and the reactions of the emigrants, and trying to provide, to illuminate the underlying factors that condition those interactions. Okay, so those of you who were here yesterday have seen this slide before. Forgive me, but I think it is useful for everyone else. It seems to me what I try to do in this representation, this visual, is to represent the view of the world that I think is held both by the person in the street, but also by most social scientists. And that is to say that this is a world in which states are nations, are societies. So that is to say that a state is the society of its people. The people living in the state are the state's citizens. The citizens comprise the population, and everybody who is not a citizen, who does not belong to the people, lives in some other state. So in this view of the world, we, the people, the citizens, are here, and all the aliens are there. And that this is a view that gets reproduced in every context. So if we think about destination and sending states, or future destination sending states, in each place they have a similar view. We are here, that is we, the members of the destination state, we're here, and they, the people in the future emigration state, are there. And conversely, from the standpoint of the sending state, we, the future immigrant state, we're here, and they're the aliens living in that alien place. Now, what migration, what international migration does is it disrupts that model of the world's organization. That effectively, because migration is fueled, driven by the social networks that link new arrivals to people who are already established, and because there are circuits of there are circuits by which information, ideas, and people circulate between sending and destination societies, that what international migration does then is pull one society onto the territory of another. So instead of having a world in which we have mutually exclusive states, mutually exclusive nations, mutually exclusive societies, instead what we have is a world in which we have overlapping societies, in which the state of the destination society is not simply the society of the destination people, but it is also in part the society of the sending people. And so from the standpoint of the people in the destination society, this is a deviant event, because what has happened is that the people who should be there, they ought to be there in a normal world, but in our strange world, they have come here. And of course, from the standpoint of the sending society, there also is a strange thing in that we, that is to say the members of the sending society, we are no longer all living here, rather some of us are living there. So in the previous, what I'm describing as the normal view of the world, we and they live in separate places, but here what happens is we and they end up with overlapping residences. We and they end up being part of the same society. Now, so that overlap has significant consequences for sending societies. And it's that overlap that triggers the intervention, in part, by sending societies into the lives of their immigrants. And in a way, this slide is not as, I need to revise it, but really the point is I want to link resources in the society of destination to consequences, results in the society of origin. So we can think about economic resources. The immigrants move to a richer society where they can make more, they can live better, but not only can they live better, they can save some significant portion of that money, and they can send it home to their relatives, who can then also live better. Now, if the immigrants are doing very well, and if they continue to maintain some allegiance to the people and places from which they've come, they can use some of their economic resources and not just give it to their relatives, but in fact become philanthropists. They can send what is called collective remittances. So economic resources that are not just for the relatives, but can be used by the broader community. All right? So people go from the poorer society, go to the richer society. Paradoxically, they use some of the resources in the richer society to help the people still living in the poorer society. They might obtain other resources such as training, skills, exposure to innovations, and through the contacts that they maintain with members in the sending society, the emigrants, or we might use the phrase the members of the diaspora, can be the agents by which ideas and innovations acquired in the destination society circulate back to the sending society. However, or maybe I should say in addition, the immigrants have not simply moved to a richer society, they have moved to a liberal democratic society. And that liberal, or I should say a liberal democratic state. And that fact is important for the story that I'm going to tell and for these interactions, because it means that they are able to combine economic resources with political resources they probably didn't possess before. That is to say, they are no longer subject to the coercion of the home state. The home state cannot send a police force and break up a demonstration. It can't arrest somebody for saying things that are objectionable. The police force has to stay on the sending side of the border, and that allows the immigrants to engage in political activity of a type that they wouldn't have been able to do before. Because they live in a liberal democratic society, they also find allies, especially if they frame their political activities oriented towards the homeland in terms that appeal to allies, like a struggle for human rights. So that, paradoxically, what migration does is generate a set of resources that inevitably flow back to the society of origin, and that create a challenge, pose a challenge to the sending states. And the challenge is twofold. On the one hand, the challenge is maintaining the flow of desired resources. In some sense, you could say that people moving from a poor state, let's say El Salvador, to a rich state, let's say the United States, or let's say Morocco to Spain, you could say that on some level they've won the lottery. That we see that movement from a poorer state to a richer state is very good for the migrants. But it also might be good for the people who stayed at home, because the migrants are able to send some portion of the advantages that they've gained back to the home country. So the challenge for the sending state is how to maintain the flow of resources. In some sense, the sending state won the lottery too, but how can it ensure that those resources continue to flow back? The other challenge is how to control the migrants, because as I've argued, the migrants are able to combine economic resources with political resources. They can act politically in a way that the people living at home probably couldn't. And consequently, they have a freedom and independence to foment, to trigger change in the home society that other people might not have. So this challenge for the emigration state is how to control that flow of resources and how to control the immigrants, how to prevent them from engaging in political activity that is in opposition to the preferences of the elite. Okay. So now, paradigm, so that's the challenge, how to control resources, how to maintain the flow of resources, how to control the political activity of the immigrants. And the paradox, though, it lies in the fact that the immigrants, who are also immigrants, are also aliens and citizens. So they are aliens, they are outside the polity where they live, but they continue to be citizens of the state from which they come. And because they are citizens, the state has an obligation to continue to protect them, but the state also has the right to maintain contact with its people. Right? So the reciprocal relationships between all sorts of states allows for consulates, allows for embassies. These are essentially outposts of sovereignty. A little piece of the sending country is effectively transplanted. A little piece of the sending state is effectively transplanted to the receiving state. And that then provides a platform for interacting with the migrants. Now, the sending state can't coerce the migrants, right? It can't, when the migrants lived at home, the sending state could say, you have to pay taxes, and if the migrant didn't, the potential migrant didn't want to pay taxes, the sending state could in effect reach its hand into the person's pocket, open up the wallet, and take the taxes. That can't be done in the migration context. But the migrant continues to need the sending state because the migrant is an alien. And so the migrant might need identity documents. The migrant might need to get a passport. So the migrant continues, might want to get social services that the embassy or consulate provides. So that these outposts of sovereignty provide a protected platform in which to engage with the immigrants. Now, we have relatively limited data on how often these interactions take place, but the data that we do have suggests that these interactions happen quite frequently, that for a large portion of the immigrant population, they end up going to these outposts of sovereignty. Now, what I show on the map is the ways in which these outposts of sovereignty can be expanded. So this is a map displaying the Mexican consulates in the United States, and you can see that Mexico has been able to set up consulates all over the United States. There are 51 Mexican consulates, and the consular activity is not limited to the place, the building where the consulate stands, because the Mexicans also develop mobile consulates. So there's a consulate in a big city like Los Angeles, but then the consular officials travel to other smaller cities where the population doesn't merit a consulate. So here we have a situation in which the sending state has lost control of its people, but nonetheless the fact that they are citizens both obliges the sending state to protect them and provides a platform for making that connection. And the connection is important because it is a way of maintaining engagement, of trying to maintain loyalties, but also to try to monitor, to try to engage in surveillance, perhaps to engage in policing. Because remember, when people live in a state, the state has all sorts of ways of counting them. It takes a census, there are all sorts of other interactions with the state, so the state knows a lot about its people. But when the people leave the territory, the state is no longer able to identify its people. Well, these interactions provide a mechanism for identifying the people, the immigrants who have left the territory, and for then engaging in strategies to try to influence and control them. Okay, and here is an example of how those strategies can be deployed. So one of the things that international law allows embassies and consulates to do is to provide citizens abroad with identity documents. Now, identity documents, of course, are very useful because one often is in a situation where one has to prove that one is the person whom one claims to be. So let's say I want to establish a bank account, and I claim to be Rodžera Valdingera. But unless I can prove to somebody, I can take out an identity document and say, look, U.S. passport, here's my picture, that's who I really am. If I don't have something like this, I can't establish a bank account. Well, many immigrants, especially if they immigrate as undocumented immigrants or illegal immigrants, they arrive without identity documents. So paradoxically, the fact that they are aliens, the fact that they're irregularly or illegally, and the fact that they need documents in order to survive creates an opportunity for a state like Mexico, but a state like El Salvador or Guatemala or Morocco, to identify its population and to service some of their needs. In fact, Mexico has distributed 5 to 6 million of these cards. And of course, this then leads the immigrants, where do they get the cards? They go to the consulate. And in the process of going to the consulate, they then may obtain other services, and the consulate gets the capacity to identify potential homeland activists. Okay, so what I've argued so far is that this dual, the dual social characteristics of the migrants, the fact that they are immigrants and emigrants, triggers state intervention, and the fact that the immigrants retain citizenship, the emigrants retain citizenship, means that the state can continue to interact with them, influence them, despite the fact that the emigrants are living on foreign soil. So citizenship, the possession, the retention of citizenship is a crucial factor. But there is, yet again, another paradox, and that paradox stems from the fact that as long as the immigrants/emigrants continue to be aliens, they are not able to fully access the resources that are available in the destination society. So if the sending society is thinking, well, what we want immigrants to do is send home remittances, ironically, one way to increase the flow of remittances is to get the immigrants to become citizens of the place where they live. Now, the problem for sending states is that the immigrants are often reluctant to acquire the citizenship of another country. Why is that? Because of the feeling, of the emotional content, the symbolic value of citizenship. That in acquiring another citizenship, the immigrants feel that they are betraying their country. They are betraying their people. So even though citizenship is valuable, very useful, people who are eligible for citizenship often don't try to obtain it. So how do sending states respond to that problem? Well, they respond by passing laws that allow for dual nationality, right? And that's an important signal, because what it is, the message that it's sending to the emigrants is that acquiring receiving state citizenship is not a betrayal. It's entirely consistent with our policy. You can both be a citizen of the sending state and be a citizen of the destination state. There is no conflict between the two. And in fact, what researchers have found is that immigrants from states that recently passed laws allowing for dual citizenship, that those immigrants, A, increase their rate of naturalization, so they become citizens more rapidly, and B, that their earnings increase as a result of naturalization. So, in effect, in passing laws of dual citizenship, what the sending states are doing is releasing an internal constraint, right? The immigrants feel, I can't acquire receiving state citizenship because it's a betrayal. Passing a dual citizenship law loosens that internal constraint and allows the immigrants to acquire citizenship. However, dual citizenship presumes that the immigrants are eligible to become citizens in the country where they actually reside. And eligibility for receiving state citizenship is, of course, determined by the receiving states. And so what we see is that although sending states and also receiving states are increasingly permitting dual nationality, receiving states, however, are increasing the eligibility requirements for citizenship. It is becoming increasingly difficult for immigrants to obtain receiving state citizenship. So on the one hand, the fact that the immigrants are aliens in the place where they live allows the sending states to connect with them and to, in a way, recapture the people who had voluntarily left. And yet the fact that they continue to be aliens is a constraint on the degree to which, as immigrants, these same people can continue to send back the resources that sending states want. Okay, so now, so membership is, I'm describing membership as something related to national identity. And so what we see is that on the one hand, if we think about this duality between citizens and aliens, that's a very bright boundary. Either you're a citizen or you're an alien. You can't be a citizen and an alien simultaneously. But membership is more a matter of who you think you are and who other people think you are. And so it's possible for a person to claim to be a member of a society, whether that person has citizenship or not, and it's possible for someone else to either accept that claim or to reject it. Now, it often happens that the immigrants develop a sense of membership in the place where they actually reside. Now, they develop that sense of membership because that place is often very attractive. It offers them a set of possibilities they didn't enjoy before. And as a society, it's often quite open. That is to say, there are opportunities to develop closer social relationships as a coworker, as a neighbor, as a friend, as a spouse, to natives, citizens, full members. And so that the boundary, this informal boundary between members and non-members, often becomes diffuse. So people who are not citizens, nonetheless, begin to think of themselves as members and are seen as members. And precisely because those boundaries are so diffuse, sending states are often very concerned about that attenuating sense of membership. And if we look at sending state policies, what we see is that a common element consists of policies oriented towards cultural retention, that sending states invest in language instruction for the children of immigrants. They try to maintain cultural programs. They try to do a lot of things to reinforce this sense of national identity that they see as being weakened by continued residence in the receiving state. Now, one of the ways in which sending states try to deepen the sense of membership is by developing a new definition of nationhood. And the view is that the nation is no longer found in the territory, so the people, the we, are no longer simply contained to the territory, but now the nation is wherever the population turns out to be. So this concept of a deterritorialized nation, and for the migrants who are the most homeland-oriented in their own lives, they adopt that orientation as well. And so their view is that even though they are physically absent, they are nonetheless socially, culturally, psychologically present. So now, so that the deterritorialized nation provides a way of, on the one hand, retaining loyalty, and on the other hand, provides the justification for claims that the migrants can make on the society where they no longer live. And there are two types of problems that ensue. On the one hand, the migrants want to make claims on the society of origin. So they might, for example, this is a common phenomenon, they might ask for the privilege of voting abroad. They no longer live in country A, they live in country B, but they think of themselves as members of country A and they want to vote. Right? So that, of course, is a very complicated issue. It raises this question of who are the people? Does the people encompass only the people living in the population residing in the territory, or does it encompass everybody who is of the same origin, right? And so often there is a conflict between the membership claims of the migrants and the views of the residents in the sending country who perceive the migrants as having changed. They're no longer the same. Why are they no longer the same? Because they live there, the migrants live there, among them, that is, in that foreign population, in that foreign place, and they have become like them. So that even though the migrants assert themselves to be part of this deterritorialized nation, from the standpoint of the residents still at home, they increasingly appear like them. The problem for the migrants is that their foreign origin continues to taint them, create a shadow over their legitimacy in the society of residence. So even if they have the passport, right, they may acquire citizenship, nonetheless, the fact of having foreign origins undermines their claim for membership in the place where they live. So on the one hand, as immigrants looking home, they make a claim on that society, but that claim is undermined because they are perceived, because of the place of residence. They make the claim on the basis of origin. We come from sending society, but the people in the sending society reject it because the migrants live there. In the receiving society, the migrants look for membership, but the people around them reject it because, on the grounds that, well, the migrants are living here, but they really belong there. Okay. I talked about that. Okay, so there's two other points. I don't know how I'm doing for time. Okay. So the migrants are foreign they are foreign in a double sense. That is to say, they're people living in a foreign country, and by foreign I mean strange. That is, this is a place that they don't quite understand, and a place where they are treated as foreigners. That is, people who don't belong. And that combination of living in a foreign, strange place and being foreigners, strangers, means that they are vulnerable to exploitation, means that bad things can happen to them because of their foreign status. And those bad things, in effect, trigger or push sending states to intervene. Now, to engage with the migrants, not because they're obliged to, not because the migrants are citizens, but because the migrants are perceived as members of the national family. That, in a way, migration itself is politically scandalous. Why did the people have to leave in the first place if it weren't for the fact that the state couldn't take care of them? So now they're living in a foreign place. Well, at the minimum, the state needs to protect them from the most exploitative activities. Okay, so the last point I want to make concerns the duality between immigrant politics and immigrant politics. And so this is a point that I made earlier in the presentation, that the movement to a foreign polity ironically increases the migrants' ability to exercise influence at home. That is, prior to migration, they were poor people, they were ignored, they had low status, but simply by virtue of migrating to a richer place, and then also a place where they're protected, where they have more freedom, these same people who were ignored now have the capacity to exercise influence that the sending state cannot afford to ignore. Paradoxically, though, the sending state, I mean, on one hand, what migrants do politically can be threatening, but on the other hand, it can be helpful insofar as the immigrants can also behave as immigrants. That is to say, they can get involved in hostland politics and destination state politics. They can behave as ethnic lobbies trying to influence destination countries in ways that sending states want. So that, on the one hand, migration gives the migrants new tools of political influence, and yet it also might allow sending states to convert them into tools of influence in a more powerful place. Again, though, the dualism creates a problem, and that is to say that the danger for the immigrants is that they are seen as the instrument of some foreign power, of some foreign country. They're not seen as members, but rather they're seen as a Trojan horse, some foreign influence that is somehow inside and therefore is threatening. And of course, on the other end, they might also be seen as foreign, as a Trojan horse. In their involvement in homeland matters, they are actually acting at the behest or to promote the interests of the place where they live. Right? So again, they are caught in this duality. In the place where they reside, as immigrant activists, the immigrants can be perceived as the agents of the state of origin. In the state of origin, because the immigrants live in a foreign country, when they engage in politics oriented towards the state of origin, they can be seen as agents of the state of destination. So that overlap, the fact that they are living there, but nonetheless try to maintain the sense of we, is a constraint on their ability to engage both in emigrant and in immigrant politics. Okay, all right, so I'm almost done. Last slide. So to wrap up, what I've tried to argue is that what international migration involves is not just the displacement of individuals, but in effect the displacement of a society. That the migrants bring with them their social relations to other migrants, their continuing social relations to the places they left behind, and in so doing then, two societies that once were thought of as being separate end up overlapping. And consequently, what happens is that they who used to live there are now here. That's a standpoint, that's a viewpoint of the destination society. But from the standpoint of the sending society, we all used to live here, some of us live there. So the migrants are both, they're both here and there, they're both them and us, and they are in this in-between situation. And the in-between situation is simultaneously a source of influence and power. They draw resources from that situation, and yet it also is a source of constraint and vulnerability. And the dilemma is that by being here and there, by being we and them, the migrants risk rejection both by the people among whom they live and the people from whom they came. And so in concluding, the last point I want to make is that progress in the field of migration studies, I believe, has to go beyond the dichotomy that I pointed out at the start, that is between studies that are immigration-oriented and studies that are emigration-oriented, but rather we need an approach that tries to look at the connections, the interactions between emigration and immigration, all of the things that bring societies together, but also the processes and mechanisms that cut those ties apart. So thank you very much. Okay, questions? Yes,
if our students are thinking about questions, I have one question regarding this dual nationality.
Yes.
Because this is quite actual question that was discussed also in previous European Sociologist Association conference regarding different migration politics, and I know that many American Latvians or Latvian Americans have both passports, both USA and of Latvia. And in the same, for example, with Latvians in Sweden. I know for sure that in Sweden it is, how to say, partly illegal. The state allowed that in beginning of 90s. No, it is not allowed anymore. But also these passports are not, how to say, taken away. Right. How it is in USA? What is American?
U.S. law is a de facto acceptance of dual nationality. So the passports are not taken away. So there are large numbers of people who retain their home society nationality, even after they've acquired U.S. citizenship. So, but the point that I wanted to make is that there are two simultaneous but opposing trends. On the one hand, there's greater acceptance of dual nationality. So sending states are willing to allow residents to obtain the citizenship of another country, and receiving states are willing to allow those people who acquire receiving state citizenship to retain their home country citizenship. So that facilitates dual citizenship. The thing that gets in the way of dual citizenship is that citizenship requirements have become increasingly onerous. So it's harder to get over that bar. Once you're over the bar, then it's easier to have that dual attachment. But the bar has risen. And of course, that's something that the sending states cannot influence. That is a receiving state policy that is affected only by politics in the receiving state. Yes?
I have the following question, which is connected with your notion of deterritorialized nation.
Yes.
Yes, on the one hand, at the very beginning of your lecture, you said that you will not look on these problems, how to say, from historical point of view. On the other hand, maybe my question is wrong and not in connection with what you said, but nevertheless, you know, in Europe you cannot just separate yourself and say, no, it's not no connection. When I look on this notion and I listen, that I have in mind this long discussion in European as a political tradition between two understandings of nation. Yes? One, how to say French, which usually in the current situation is connected mainly in popular consciousness and in political speech with America, which is French by origin, yes, that you are a member of nation when you participate in political life. It doesn't matter are you, for example, German, or you have to speak French and you have to participate in political life. On the other hand, in this European tradition from 18th century, we have German understanding of nation, yes? That nation is spirit, nation is, how to say this, Volksgeist, yes? And then, everywhere where you are, yeah, you are, how to say, member of nation, and that's some obligation, protection, and so on. And we know very good that in situation with, when we speak about the development of this idea, it came, especially when we speak about Germans between two world wars, that this, deterritorialized, I cannot pronounce this English word so good, nation, came at the end to this territorialized understanding of nations. So where are Germans? That is Germany, yeah? Which is bad thing. Of course, I don't speak now about so, how to say, so extreme, and you also in the very beginning said that you speak about liberal democratic states and relations in connection with how to say, contemporary this international order. On the other hand, for example, when we speak about Russia, that we have some, not in other aspects, yes, aspects we have something similar conception, because that is what they call Russian world. Yeah, so Russia is to some extent everywhere where there are people who are not only Russian but who speak Russian. So my question is the following, do you, how to say, expect to some extent that also this understanding may have some, how to say, also political consequences which may become dangerous sometimes? So, and what to do? But maybe it's not in connection with your main argument, so that's why.
No, I mean that's actually an excellent point, and I think if we go back to the 19th century, we could describe the German concept of nationhood as exactly being that of a deterritorialized nation, because not only were Germans living outside Germany in Europe, but of course many Germans immigrated to the United States, and so that created of course, a basic conflict having to do with military service. Would the Germans, immigrants, have to serve in the U.S. Army, or did they retain military obligations to Germany? And what would happen to their citizenship? Could they retain German citizenship? And in many ways, it seems to me that if we focus on the policies, the citizenship policies of sending states, not the citizenship policies of receiving states, but if we look at the citizenship policies of sending states, they look much more like the German than the French model. That the interest is in maintaining contact with the nation abroad. So let me give you some examples. So one of the, to give you an idea of how, I mean, what we're talking about here in a way is, I mean, it's a new form of the, quote, imagined community, right? A very famous book in the literature of nationalism. So I'm not, when I talk about nation, I'm not talking about nation as a real existing thing. I'm talking about nation as an understanding, an idea. Now, so one thing that's interesting is that when states, as well as the immigrants, when they talk about this deterritorialized nation, they often actually give it a territorial form, in the sense that, for example, the Haitians will talk about the 10th department, right? So Haiti has 9 departments, but there's a 10th department which is located wherever the Haitians live. Ecuador has a similar expression. And Poland, for example, historically thought about the Poles abroad as Polonia. So that, and we could go on. I mean, the Italians would talk about the Italians of the world. So that these ongoing connections between the immigrants and the places of origin led to new ways of thinking about the nation. Of course, the implication is, if we think that, well, all the Italians all over the world, they are Italians, well, that's a question. Are they? And now one very good way, I think, of illustrating this conflict between these, in a way, the conflict between the attachment to the place of origin and the attachment to the place of destination, and the way in which these experiences change the immigrants is by looking at the houses that the immigrants build in the places from which they come. So we could look at these, I mean, this is a 19th century, a phenomenon of 1912, so I don't know about Latvia, but certainly in Poland, elsewhere in Eastern Europe, many of the immigrants who came to the United States returned. Over half returned. Over half of the Italians returned. Well, they returned with, the luckier ones, returned with money. And with that money, they built houses. Well, those were much bigger houses. They were much nicer houses. They were houses that the people who stayed behind called the American houses. Now, if you go to sending communities in Latin America or in Africa, you see exactly the same thing. So if you go, let's say, to a sending community in El Salvador, what you will see is that there are these huge houses. I mean, everything else is small, one-story. You have these huge two-story houses with garages that someone like myself comes from California, I'll say, this is exactly what exists in the California suburbs. And of course, what's so striking is that on the one hand, the house is a tangible, a material sign of the immigrants' commitment to the place where they come from. They want to demonstrate their attachment by investing their resources. On the other hand, they can't help but invest those resources in ways that show how much they have changed, right? They're no longer like everyone else, not simply because they have more money, but because they have different needs, different expectations, different values. And so I think that's the type of conflict I'm trying to underline in this talk between perceptions and behavior indicating an attachment, and yet other perceptions and behavior indicating that something has been lost. Yes?
Can a state, at least in theory, be both a sending state and a receiving state for another nation? Do you happen to know any such examples? Or is it a strict dichotomy?
No. In a way, okay, the clearer, what is clear is that there are numerous states that were sending states that are not receiving states. So that certainly is the case for Southern Europe. Italy sent immigrants up until the mid-1970s, and then it began to receive immigrants. Spain sent immigrants, became a country of immigration. Portugal, Greece, and of course, in all of these countries, I mean, this involved required a fundamental change in the frame of mind, because the countries thought of themselves as countries of emigration, and all of a sudden they were faced with an influx of immigration. And one of the consequences of this is that in the new immigration countries of Southern Europe, they began to tighten naturalization requirements. That their orientation had always been, how can we keep the Italians or the Spaniards abroad loyal? Now they were faced with another problem, which is what to do about these newly arrived foreigners that they never had. Now, it does happen that one of the consequences of migration is the depletion of the local labor force, that everybody who can work leaves, or most of the people who can work leave, and consequently what one will find in a number of immigration societies that they become immigration societies. So I'll give you two examples of this. One is the clearest in parts of El Salvador is a very high level of immigration, but in the places where there has been the highest emigration, there is now some immigration from Nicaragua and Honduras, which are even poorer. So they need agricultural workers, and the agricultural workers are Nicaraguans and Hondurans. Another similar case, not identical, but similar, is in Mexico. So Mexico, as I described yesterday, there's an area in the center of Mexico that has been a historic exporter of people to the United States. Well, so many people have left that there is nobody left to work in the fields. So who are the agricultural workers? They are indigenous people, Indians, from southern Mexico. So they're not international migrants, but they are migrants. So the people from central Mexico went to the United States, and the people from southern Mexico moved to central Mexico to replace the immigrants. And it may well be the case that Mexico, like Italy and Greece, will undergo just that transition. Having been a country of immigration, it will become, having been a country of emigration, it will become a country of immigration, pulling in migrants from much poorer places in Latin America. Other questions? Yes?
I wanted to ask about the negative ties within the migrants network, because migrating is not always winning a lottery, and it's well-known fact that most people that were sold or became victims of human trafficking, they were sold by people that they knew, or at least they had some connections. Yeah. And I wanted to ask if you know some studies that went more deep into the topic. How does this affect sending and hosting community, this negative experience and people being sent away on the false promises and being after exploited? Do the information come back, or?
Well, you know, that's a good question. You know, I have to confess, I really don't know the answer. You know, one of the things that I said yesterday when I gave the introductory lecture is that this field has just taken off. I mean, it is, first of all, migration is global, so there's a geographic component that I haven't talked about, in part because I don't know enough to talk about in front of an audience like this. And then the phenomenon has so many different dimensions that at least I'm not capable of mastering them all. So I really don't know the answer to your question. The one thing that I will say is that the vulnerability, at least that form of vulnerability, can become one of the criteria for gaining permanent residence. So that, I mean, you could say, of course, you're right, of course, migration is not winning the lottery for everybody. And of course, people who are trafficked or exploited suffer the most, but they often are able to call on the conscience of the destination society in a way that the typical economic migrant can't. And that then allows for the acquisition of permanent residence on the basis of having been exploited. Other questions?
Actually, Sandra's question reminded me at the beginning of your lecture about this two things that studies of migration and probably sometimes was exaggerating this movement aspects and reducing this conflict aspects.
Say it again.
So actually the focus is on the movement,
yes,
but the issues of conflict quite usually are neglected.
And conflict between?
It was not very specified, or I don't remember. And I wanted to ask about what kinds of conflicts are behind these migration issues and transnational issues of transnational.
Okay, so let me try to respond. I don't know how successful the response will be. So let's maybe I'll go back to an earlier slide. Okay, so one of the things that, you know, my point here is that the migrants are able to, despite the fact, I mean, some of them don't, of course, don't win the lottery, but it's often the case that even undocumented immigrants who go into low-skilled jobs are able to significantly improve their standard of living and send money at home. Now, some of the more successful migrants come to the conclusion that they don't simply want to help their family members. They want to do something for the community they left behind. And so they are willing to donate money. They organize together and they donate money for scholarships. They donate money for ambulances. They donate money to renovate streets or to pave streets. They donate money to foster new businesses. Okay, that's called social remittances. So I distinguish individual remittances. I send it to my father living in the home country, versus I get together with other people from my hometown. We raise money together. We have a party. Everybody kicks in a certain amount of money, and then we use that money to buy an ambulance. So that's social remittance. And again, so that testifies to the migrants' continuing commitment to the place from which they come. But paradoxically, again, these commitments turn out to often generate conflict. The reason that they generate conflict is because, number one, the migrants think of themselves as the same. Their view is, although we are physically absent, we are socially and psychologically present. But in fact, migration has transformed them. They are no longer the same people that they were when they left, and therefore they are no longer the same as the people they left behind. Their view of what is good for the home community is not necessarily the view of the people who still live there. They don't know the home community as well as they think they do, since they have not lived there. And very often, they no longer have widespread connections. They may have an uncle or maybe even a parent, but their contacts in the home community are limited. So just the way the house symbolizes, I think, or crystallizes this the tension between being oriented towards the home and the place of origin, place of destination, social remittances demonstrate that same duality, but it creates conflict, because the migrants want to do good for the people left behind, but they don't necessarily want to do good in the way that the people left behind want. And so, hopefully that answers your question. Yes?
What are the main reasons why, say, countries decide to give the dual nationality? What are the reasons why?
The sending countries allow...
No, receiving countries.
Well, yes, okay, so the receiving country, the reasoning is exactly the same as the sending country. So that is, well, not exactly the same, but similar. That is to say, the view certainly among some officials, among some political leaders, among advocates of immigrant rights, the view is that the integration of immigrants is impeded by the fact that they are not becoming citizens. So if we want the foreigners to become nationals, if we want the Mexicans to become Americans, the Moroccans to become French, the Turks to become Germans, we need to allow them to become citizens. They'll never fully integrate if they always stay aliens. States then, the people who think about this, they realize that one of the constraints is the one that I identified. It's internal. This feeling on the part of the immigrants that if I become a U.S. citizen, I'm betraying Mexico. So just the way Mexico is trying to release that constraint, say to the Mexican, you become an American, you can stay Mexican, no betrayal. Similarly, when receiving states allow for dual nationality, they're sending that same signal. Canada's a good example. You can remain a Vietnamese citizen, but you can become a Canadian. There's no conflict between your Canadian citizenship and your Vietnamese citizenship. So dual nationality is seen as a mechanism of integration. Yes?
But do you think that many states don't want to give their citizenship just to...
Well, again, it's a matter of there's a lot of conflict over this. So that dual, I mean, the paradox is that by and large, certainly permanent residents, legal permanent residents of the developed states have the great majority of rights enjoyed by citizens. I mean, some rights they don't have, but they have many rights. Citizenship, therefore, mainly is of symbolic value. It's in preventing immigrants from gaining citizenship, the nationals are not putting a huge obstacle in the way of their material progress. The aliens can do, even as long as you have permanent residency, many options are available to you. But the importance of the symbolic difference between citizens and aliens is such that there's tremendous resistance, popular resistance to dual nationality, and also increasing insistence on more stricter eligibility requirements for citizenship. Yes?
Yes, thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. I just have a short comment, and perhaps you can comment on my comment.
Sure.
So it's regarding the motivation of the sending states. You basically focus on this sending back resources. But this argument doesn't quite fit in the context of post-communist states, like, for example, for Latvian and for the states which have very big population problems, depopulation. So they need to have this bond with their immigrants, just so in some cases they would come back. So not so much this focus on this sending materials, resources back, but just to keep this bond. Yes.
Okay, so yes, I mean that's a very good point. Something that I hadn't fully considered. I mean, I guess I would say my response would be, of course, that people themselves are often seen as a resource. And of course, what we see, I would assume, I mean, from your description, I would think that one of the factors that weakens the attachment of Latvians abroad to Latvia is their social acceptance in the places where they live. Not only can they make more money, but they gradually become part of the society in which they live. They begin to have non-Latvian friends, non-Latvian neighbors, etc. And so the emotional tie weakens. So that, in part, is the motivation of the sending state to try to retain the loyalty. Without the loyalty, the people go as well. Yes?
But maybe in this connection we may take into account also one big difference between many countries, what you mentioned in your lecture, for example, like El Salvador or Mexico, or, for example, Morocco. No, I cannot say about Mexico, but Morocco and El Salvador.
Yes.
And when we compare with these post-communist societies, I think that very important moment is that is to some extent, very specific societies which came through modernization, of course in Soviet style or communist style, but nevertheless they are to great extent modernized societies with how to say, for example, birth rate and all the demographic qualifications, who are characteristic for developed societies, but who are nevertheless backward societies in terms of income and so on, and it creates these, how to say, to some extent, when we speak about Latvia, with negative saldo of migration, with about 8 for, I think, 10,000 or what, I don't remember exactly, which is absolutely catastrophic. Yeah. When we were, for example, in the end of Soviet time, we were 2.6 million, now we are 2 million. Wow. As a result of migration. So we lost more people than in the Second World War. So maybe it's also to some extent explanation when you have, on the one hand, society with many characteristics of modern societies, but in this level of income, which is characteristic for sometimes for third world, for Morocco, for example, with huge increase, with huge, still very high birth rate and all the things, so demographic resources.
Well, okay, so of course, this is, my excuse is that this phenomenon is too complicated for me to, I can't stretch the bounds of my knowledge far enough. But I think a more positive reply is that. This is what you're identifying is an understudied, but I think very important aspect of this phenomenon. And I think that there's a great deal of at least scholarly interest in the relationship between sending states and immigrants. This dimension, which I don't know whether it only holds for Latvia, but whether it holds for the other Baltic states, that seems to me this is something that has not been, I haven't seen it developed in the literature, and that would be a way, pursuing that theme would, I think, engage the interests of a broader scholarly community. That's a very worthwhile research topic. I mean, the one thing I want to, the one example that comes to mind of a post-socialist state where that fits this framework better would be Armenia. Right, of course, which is a much poorer state with a very large diaspora. And so where, again, the Armenian state is trying to find ways of gaining resources from the Armenian diaspora without, however, succumbing to the political influence of the Armenian diaspora, which is much more anti-Turkey than is the Armenian Republic itself. And so that's in my view, that was a good example of precisely the types of conflicts I've tried to talk about. Okay, well, thank you very much.